Welcome to Sikhcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
In this episode of the Sikhcast, join researchers Sirdar Singh and Damanpreet Singh as they reflect on Vaisakhi and the principles of sovereignty. The two discuss Damanpreet Singh's article titled Sirdar Kapur Singh's Idea of the Sikh Homeland. Listen in as they explore how the great 20th century Sikh thinker, philosopher, and politician, Sirdar Kapur Singh, imagined the Sikh homeland, especially within the constraints of the Republic of India.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining us today on the Sikhcast. Today we are joined by Damanpreet Singh, who is a research associate at the Sikh Research Institute and is currently pursuing his PhD in American Studies at Yale University. Damanpreet Singh is focusing on American missionaries in colonial Punjab in the era after the British took over Punjab, I believe. My name is Sirdar Singh, and I'm also a fellow research associate here at the Sikh Research Institute. And I will be speaking to Damanpreet today about his article that we just published at Sikhri, Sirdar Kapur Singh's Idea of the Sikh Homeland, which explores how the great 20th century Sikh thinker, philosopher, and politician Sirdar Kapur Singh imagined the Sikh homeland, especially within the constraints of the Republic of India. So welcome, Damanpreet Singh, to the Sikhcast today. I'm really excited to be talking to you about this really wonderful article. And do you have anything to say before we get into the questions? Did you want to introduce anything?
No, I don't. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Awesome. Yeah, let's get into it then. So to begin with, Kapur Singh is sort of a giant of 20th century Sikh intellectual history, but not everybody may be as familiar with him as we are. And so let's do a little brief introduction about Kapur Singh, who he was, when he lived, and so on.
Yeah, so Sirdar Kapur Singh, as you've already started to say, was one of the significant thinkers of the Sikh Punjab in the 20th century. He lived from 1909 to 1986. So his life really spanned some of the most significant decades of the 20th century. And he was at different points worked as a kind of political person. He also was a bureaucrat early in his career, and he also published extensively from, let me say, the 50s, basically to the end of his life, on issues related to Sikh thought, Sikh history, the politics of postcolonial Punjab. So this is a kind of well-educated bureaucrat who is really observing the transition from colonialism to the new post-colonial situation after 1947. There's an interesting episode in this part of his life where he actually ends up leaving the civil service over issues related to what the status of the Punjab will be in this new post-colonial India. He writes a book which kind of explains how this happens, called Sachi Sakhi, which is, I think, published in the early 50s. And really after that, after his kind of foray as a bureaucrat, I think that's when I see him coming of real intellectual age. In the 50s and 60s, he really becomes involved in the politics around what Punjab's relationship will be to post-colonial India. So he becomes involved, importantly, in the demand for a Punjabi Suba, for example, right? A majority Punjabi-speaking state in the 50s and 60s, in the early post-colonial years, when language becomes the chief idiom through which these now states in post-colonial India are imagining their relationship to the center in Delhi. From after the 50s and 60s, after 1966, when some version of the Punjabi Suba is granted, he really begins to theorize in earnest, kind of seeing the limitations of a Punjabi-speaking state for the Sikhs. He starts to imagine what a Sikh homeland would look like within post-colonial India. So you'll see in his writings in the 60s, 70s, and through 1986, though he doesn't really publish a great deal in the 80s, you'll see him really trying to elaborate an idea of what a Punjab that's oriented around the idea of Sikh nationhood could look like in relation to a post-colonial India. Throughout this period, as I said, he's publishing a lot, he's writing a lot on topics spanning the political present, but also issues of Sikh thought and Sikh history. He publishes some books, but he's mostly publishing essays, many of which appear in publications like the Sikh Review. And when he is a politician, first serving in the upper house of the Indian Parliament briefly, and then as an MLA in Punjab, he's also delivering speeches, right, as a political person. So we have kind of a really vast record of his thinking because of this, and we can see the ways in which, through his thinking, he really leaves us with a lot to think about with, how the early post-colonial decades, what the post-colonial decades really meant for the Sikhs and the issues that were most important for the Sikhs from the 50s through the 80s.
Yeah, and he casts a really long shadow, doesn't he? He is really someone who scholars still today, especially Bantuk scholars, will quote, will be inspired by his works. He was very popular in the 80s and 90s during the Khalsa movement. A lot of people saw something inspiring in his works and the way that he understood the Sikh nation during that time period. He also was at the center of a lot of really important Sikh political episodes in the 20th century. So, for example, he wrote the Anandpur Sahib Resolution. He drafted the original version. He wrote the original report after the 1978 Vaisakhi massacre in Amritsar. So really just such an important figure. And that's what I really love about this article is that you've narrowed down on one really important topic. It's sort of maybe in a lot of ways the most important topic in Kapur Singh's writing and really helped us explore it. And I want to get into the article now, and I want to talk about some of the specific things that you bring up. In the essay, you argue that for Sirdar Kapur Singh, a Sikh homeland is inalienable, inevitable, and necessary. How do those three terms differ, and why was that three-part framework important to his thinking? That inalienable, inevitable, and necessary.
Yeah. So as I was reading some of his speeches and various essays that he'd written on this question of the Sikh homeland and what a Sikh polity looks like, and I think those are two important aspects of his writing. Is he was both trying to imagine what a demand for a Sikh homeland could look like in his present, but also trying to understand the historical precedent of a Sikh polity and drawing on that to make his argument for a homeland. And I think as he did that, I kind of started to see that there really were three central parts of his argument, which is the subtitle. And each of these parts of his argument fits in together, but also represents a distinct aspect of how he kind of narrates the legitimacy of a Sikh homeland, we can say, right? So the first is that he argues quite directly that a Sikh homeland is inalienable from the Sikhs, which is to say that the idea of a Sikh homeland, though it might change form and it might require flexibility in its present, is always going to be part of the collective, let's say, Sikh inheritance. A Sikh homeland cannot be removed from the collective of the Sikhs, from the Bant. Right? So he says that quite straightforwardly, and that's the inalienable part.
Yeah, that this is something that really connects us back to the Gurus and something that has been an integral part of the Sikh experience from its very inception, according to Kapur Singh. Yeah,
and it's impossible to remove that from Sikh collective understanding and collective struggle. He secondly will argue that historically a Sikh homeland is inevitable, which is to say he really seemed to have a sense that a Sikh homeland, and that's not to say the Sikh homeland that he argued for was the definitive one, but a Sikh homeland was going to come to pass for the Sikhs. And he saw this through a deep reading of Sikh history, starting from the period of the embodied gurus through the period following the gurus, particularly the period of the missals, which he really saw as a great moment of possibility for what a Sikh polity could look like. He really saw that the collective of the Sikhs, the Khalsa, had consistently and continually fought for a Sikh homeland, and it would actually be an inevitable kind of outcome of the Khalsa's centuries-long, generations-long struggle. And finally, speaking to the political urgency that really defined much of his writing and thinking and talking, he saw in the post-colonial situation a Sikh homeland, which is to say, and we'll get into the elements of the demand shortly, but which is to say an autonomous Sikh Punjab that has a constitution of its own framing within the confines of an Indian republic, so has some relationship to the center in Delhi, but also has autonomy, was politically necessary. So you mentioned, for example, his 1978 report, They Massacre Sikhs, where he talks about the massacre of 1978. He's really observing through the 50s, 60s, and 70s a kind of heightening political urgency. And he's observing that formal autonomy for a Sikh Punjab was really a matter of life or death, and is really politically necessary in that way. There's no kind of getting around that. There's no compromise there.
So it's necessary in that way. Did he also mean necessary in another way, that the Sikhs had something to offer the rest of India that was important?
He did. He really, throughout his writing, will argue that if given autonomy, and I never really like that phrase, but because autonomy is not given, but is maybe exercised. But if the Sikhs were able to really assert their autonomy in post-colonial India, they would have the ability to make great contributions to the Indian nation. He'll argue that consistently, and that might be, there are different ways in which that might be received by a contemporary reader, given one's own relationship to the idea of an India, for example, or even given the kind of current day politics of India, right, and Indian nationalism. But I find it helpful to think about Kapur Singh as representing, like many thinkers of his time did, who really came of intellectual and political age in the era of a wave of decolonization in the middle of the 20th century. He was really trying to imagine how India, which had been colonized for centuries by 1947, could emerge on the world stage as a nation with it kind of its own, setting its own agenda. So he did kind of have an attachment to that kind of vision of a post-colonial nationhood. And he understood the Sikhs as possessing their own national status that had to be respected and had to be kind of viewed on its own terms on the international stage. But he also, I think, saw the Sikhs as having something to offer to India, which could emerge as a strong post-colonial nation state on its own terms. So for him, it was not, and we'll talk about this, I imagine, shortly, but for him, it was not the idea that there would be a Sikh nation state of its own, which at different points in there are different names that people are giving a Sikh homeland at this time, from Sikhistan to Khalistan. He never really is making a demand for national autonomy in that way, a separatist demand, but really seeing the Sikhs as having, as their autonomy as actually contributing to the growth of a post-colonial Indian nation state in some way, which the Indian nationalism of the Indian National Congress, which is dominant at the time throughout the early post-colonial decades, does not have room to accommodate that kind of nationalism, Sikh nationalism. So that's his main critique, right? His critique is of that kind of Indian nationalism rather than the idea of a cohesive India.
For sure. And for those of our listeners who are from Canada or have familiarity with Canadian politics, I think what Kapur Singh is imagining is something very similar to what Quebec has, where Quebec is considered a nation within Canada, which is itself a nation state. That Sikhs would be a nation within this larger nation state and would have certain rights and responsibilities within that structure. And that's something that's really important to think about, is that in spite of, or maybe not in spite, maybe because of his legacy, he was never really advocating for a separate Sikh homeland during those post-colonial, post-partition years. He was seeking something within the Indian nation state.
Mm-hmm.
And what changes after partition that makes Kapur Singh formulate the question in this way, that makes him think of that Sikhs need to be within the country of India, but need to have autonomy within that structure?
Well, I think he views partition as, and as many Sikh leaders did, as a great betrayal, right? That there were promises made to the Sikhs, promises of various kinds of autonomy that would be recognized. And those promises quickly are foreclosed, right? Nehru, doesn't have kind words for Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India after partition, who he basically sees as having betrayed the Sikhs. And what he sees, and I think I would generally agree with, is a post-colonial Indian state which is so concerned with consolidating itself as a cohesive nation state. And it's so large, and famously, everyone will say how diverse India is, right? So there's so many languages and ethnicities and so forth. I think the Nehruvian kind of approach to consolidating the Indian nation state is kind of imagining a kind of citizen democracy where every citizen is a kind of secular citizen who has a relationship to the central government in Delhi. And that doesn't leave room for various claims of autonomy nested within in India. And I think he sees this is why he doesn't have kind words or any kind of affinity for the kind of nationalism of the Indian National Congress, especially after partition, when Nehru's vision is really the one, right, as he's the prime minister. So he really views partition as a betrayal of the Sikhs, and it's a betrayal by the Indian National Congress of the Sikhs. And at the same time, like many other thinkers of this period who are thinking in what we can call the emergent third world, he also is seeing dramatic transformation. I mean, it's without a doubt decolonization is a major transformation at the world's order, but also for individuals. And there's a lot of violence in the case of Punjab. We can think of the displacement and violence of partition, but I think there's also a sense that in this new emergent world order, where there is kind of this wave of post-colonial nations now, there is, I think, a sense of possibility that emerges, right? That though partition was a betrayal, and there is a kind of urgency for some kind of autonomy in the face of this betrayal, now is a time when things are being reimagined. And now is a time perhaps when the Sikh homeland too can be reimagined. Is there a way in which Sikh autonomy, Sikh sovereignty can actually be enjoyed by the Sikh collective in this new post-colonial order, which is why I think he never is doing, he's never going separatist, I think, for that reason, right?
Yeah.
The Anandpur Sahib resolution, is not a separatist document, for example, right?
Yeah.
It's a demand for greater autonomy within a structure in which I think he sees some kind of possibility for the Sikhs to emerge on the world stage.
Yeah, that's really important to keep in mind that pre-84, pre-Kalukara, that there is this pride that even Bantuk leaders have for being Indian and for having helped the country get independence from the British, for example.
Yeah.
And Kapur Singh is a part of that. And even though Sikhs were constantly being called separatist, they weren't actually separatist at all. They were just asking for rights within that structure.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think the collective element of the demand is what allowed the, we can say, propagandist to paint the Sikhs as separatists, because what he'll go to pains to try to say is that the part of the inalienability of the Sikh homeland is that a state must always deal with the Sikhs as a collective.
Yes.
The secular state wants to deal with its citizens as individuals who are granted rights and who fight for their rights as individuals. There's no room in that model for the collective national status of the Sikhs. And I think that is, there are people in good faith who are misunderstanding that, certainly, but then there's also, I think lots of room for various propagandists to kind of paint that demand as just kind of extreme and separatist and kind of really making it just dismissing it kind of out of hand, right?
Yeah, or that term that's used a lot in India, communalist.
Right.
Meaning where you're pitting one community against another, essentially, which Sikhs are often claim that we are communalists in India. Yeah, that's something that we're that's one of the common attacks, especially in the 70s and 60s, that Sikhs were facing.
Yeah.
Let's move on from that and let's talk about Sikh sovereignty a little bit more. I thought one of the strongest parts of the essay was your discussion of Harmandir Sahib or Darbar Sahib, in that famous essay that Kapur Singh wrote, Golden Temple, its Theopolitical Status. And in that essay, Kapur Singh talks about what he calls, quote unquote, double sovereignty. Can you unpack what he means by double sovereignty and why the relationship between sacred space and political authority is so central to his thought?
Yeah. So as you're saying, in 1974, in the Sikh Review, Kapur Singh publishes this piece, Golden Temple, its Theopolitical Status. I think it's probably his most famous piece of writing, at least amongst his Sikh readers. I think that's probably true.
Yep.
It's probably that and De Masker Sikhs, right, are the big ones.
Yes.
The report on behalf of the SGPC after 1978. But in any case, in the Golden Temple piece, which is one of my favorite pieces of his writing, he basically argues that the space of the Darbar Sahib complex, and we can think in very basic terms, the physical location of the Agal Takht as a cross from Harmandir Sahib and connected by that causeway, that like bridge, right? The space itself of the Darbar Sahib complex, the relationship between the physical location of Agal Takht and Harmandir Sahib represents, again, something that's inalienable to the Sikhs, which is that sovereignty over what he'll call the realms of the unseen and the seen worlds. So the unseen world, we can say, is the realm of
Bidi, right?
Of Bidi.
Yes.
Cannot be separated from the realm of the kind of this worldly political work that we have to do as people living in the world. And that is encapsulated in the space of the Darbar Sahib complex importantly, but also can be kind of extrapolated out to understanding how we as Sikhs ought to orient ourselves to kind of political work. And he's writing the piece at a time when people are arguing that the use of the space of the complex for so-called political things, this worldly political actions, is actually a profaning of its sacred status. And he's actually saying that's actually not the case, that it's always been that these two things, the realms of the seen and the unseen, are actually always our concern together as Sikhs.
Yeah.
And he does something interesting in that article, which is he basically goes, he starts the article with a whole discussion of how the space itself has always had some kind of significance. So even before what we now know as the Darbar Sahib complex was erected, there was always some kind of attachment or pull that various kinds of people had to the space. So he starts with that, which I think is very interesting to read. And something always important to remember when reading Kapur Singh, especially when he's doing kind of historical writing, is that it's less important whether he's saying things that are absolutely accurate and more important to think about, like, what is he arguing by doing this, right?
Yes.
So I don't even, which is just to say, it's not even useful to go through, what history he narrates, but he starts there. And then he goes on to describe how Darbar Sahib becomes centrally important to the Sikhs. And then he describes basically from, I think, roughly 1721 onward, a history of kind of continual attack on the space of the Darbar Sahib, starting with Ahmed Shah onward, right? And he basically describes various attempts by him to kind of destroy the space of the Darbar Sahib complex because this kind of idea of double sovereignty was so perplexing and so dangerous. This idea that kind of day-to-day political work could be actually kind of spiritually inspired,
Yes.
to use the Western word or whatever, could actually be of a piece with one's understanding of divinity, kind of was completely perplexing and also kind of always posed some kind of material danger. So there have been so many attempts, he narrates, to just destroy the space.
Yeah.
And I think, maybe that's enough to say there are specifics about how he understands the relationship of the colonial state to this space of the Darbar Sahib complex that are interesting to talk about. But he ends the piece with the post-colonial state's relationship to the complex, right?
Yes.
And he basically says that this is of a piece with earlier invasions. And of course, the article ends up becoming really important and is reprinted and things in 1984 when the state does in fact attack the space of the complex.
Yes.
And is part of the reason we read it so much now. But it is important to note that he wrote it 10 years before that actually happened, right? So there's kind of a great deal of foresight that he's showing here, with kind of where things are headed.
Yes.
And in it, he also argues that any state which fails to recognize the kind of sovereign status of the space of the Darbar Sahib complex is kind of going down a path of its own destruction, right? Which is to say the Khalsa will always be antagonistic to and fight against such a state that violates the sovereignty of the space. So I think those are some of the important aspects of that piece. And he uses that to basically argue for, it's not only that the space itself is inalienable from the Sikhs, cannot be removed from the Sikhs, but it's also that, I think philosophically, this space represents the kind of sovereignty of kind of Sikhs as collective and Sikhs that Sikhs have to be recognized as a collective and dealt with as a collective by a state. That the space also kind of captures that kind of orientation that he's arguing for, that a state must have in relation to the Sikhs.
Yeah, it's amazing how prescient he was. Like and how important that article becomes just in 10 years. I remember when I was younger, even his book Sachi Saki, which was about his own experience getting kicked out of the IS, and then his thoughts on partition and what happened with Sikh leadership, was often republished by Khalistani organizations in the late 80s. I have editions of it that were published by Khalistani organizations. And you would think, like, what does this text this talks about partition and one man's individual, sort of employment issues, why would it be so resonant with Sikhs, in this really traumatic time period? But there's something about his writing and the way that he understood the world that really spoke to Sikhs, especially in that time period. Yeah.
Yeah, and the version that, so I have a PDF of the Golden Temple piece, which is what I usually read, but then I decided to request it from the library at my university. And the version they gave me that they had was published in 1984 by the Sikh Cultural Society of New York in Richmond Hill, right?
Yes,
which I thought was just kind of I'm not returning it to my library. It's been over.
Yeah.
You can keep that or cut
That's
that
okay.
out,
You're a PhD student. You're allowed to keep your books for as long as you want. Yeah.
but that also, I think, is, it's a republishing. There weren't edits that he made by 1984, though he was alive. But it is the kind of life of the article.
For sure.
Is important to think about. And its circulation.
Yeah. I want to move on now. Sikhs are generally very, very proud of Maharaja Ranjit Singh and his era of the Sikh kingdom, which was formerly called the Sarkari Khalsa, or the Lahore Darbar. But Kapur Singh was very critical of Ranjit Singh, and like you said earlier, saw the era before Ranjit Singh, the missiles, as sort of the height of Sikh polity. What was it why did Kapur Singh see this period not as ideal Sikh rule, but as a deviation from Khalsa political principles? What was it about this era that so bothered him and that he was so critical of?
Yeah, so he does not have nice things to say about Ranjit Singh. Maharaja, he says, is an un-Sikh-like title, which is important, and we know this, I think, in our general sense, that Sikhs never really called Ranjit Singh Maharaja. He was always Singh Sahib or
Sardarji, I believe.
Or Sardarji, yeah. But he doesn't have nice things to say about him. And I think it's really interesting to think about why. Firstly, it is just fun to read his acerbic prose about Ranjit Singh. I mean, he has lots of insults for Ranjit Singh and those around him. And it's entertaining. But what's more important than the entertainment is that he's making several important arguments about, firstly, where things went wrong, and secondly, how things can now look different. So the piece that I talk about in the article, and where he elaborates his thoughts on Ranjit Singh, to my knowledge in the most detail, is called The Sikh Raj, from a book he published called Parashar Prashna, which is a really great, one of his great books, which is really a series of essays that he wrote around questions that one of his friends, Parashar, asked him about the Sikhs, and then he ended up composing these essays and putting them together as a book. They would go on these walks in Shimla, and it's all very beautiful and etc. But in this piece, he basically is narrating a history of Ranjit Singh's rule over the Punjab. And he says that Ranjit Singh's tenure as ruler of the Punjab ought not to be understood coming out of a genealogy of the Banda Singh Bahadur and Misl period of Sikh Raj, but rather as representing a version of Hindu monarchy in the Punjab.
Yes.
By this he means that there's a tradition of what he calls Hindu monarchy in the Indian subcontinent, in which a ruler derives his authority from the kind of the class of Brahmins who kind of have various forms of knowledge, a cabinet of his own choosing, and some kind of relationship of having been legitimated by the gods, we can say.
Yes.
And this kind of monarchy, as Kapur Singh sees it, and I agree, is kind of antithetical to the kind of rule that's imagined that we can see in Guru Gobind Singh Sahib's vision, and we can see in the periods immediately following him. He says this is basically completely antithetical to any kind of Sikh traditional polity, which he really will describe. And this is in 1955 that he writes this. He describes kind of a Sikh polity as being oriented around egalitarianism, some kind of collective exercise of power, really a kind of democratic system of governance.
Yes.
And he says Ranjit Singh betrayed this almost immediately. And those around him, who were a cabinet of his own choosing, assisted in this betrayal.
Yes.
But what I think is important, there's a few things that I think are important. Firstly, why is he spending so much time thinking about Ranjit Singh? We have so much nostalgia amongst maybe in the present day. I'm not saying I have much nostalgia, but I think as a collective, we have much nostalgia. One only needs to think of the countless, one can think of the films made about Dalip Singh, right? Ranjit Singh's son and so forth.
Yes.
There's a great deal of nostalgia, and I'm not saying all of that nostalgia is misplaced, but there is a lot of nostalgia. But we're also, nearly 100 years after Kapur Singh was writing. So I think the first thing I like to think about is, for Kapur Singh, Ranjit Singh's rule was actually not that far back in the past. He actually writes in the Sikh Raj about his great-grandfather fighting in the Battle of Jallianwala during the second so-called Anglo-Sikh War, right? So this is 2 generations removed. And I think that's important to think about, and think about the kind of critiques we might have of the partition era figures that were important for the Sikhs, right? That there's, I think, a kind of urgency for him, because this is actually not that far back. So tracing it and what went wrong is actually very important to understanding his own present. The other thing that's important, I think, is that, for me at least, when I first started to read this and then reread and understand what he was really trying to argue in the piece, is that I think we have a sense that we as Sikhs lost our sovereignty in 1849, which we did with the annexation of the Punjab by the British. But he's actually arguing we lost our sovereignty in 1799.
Yep.
And colonialism is actually not the major break that we need to understand, but it's actually 1799 and the consolidation of the Punjab as the Lahore Darbar that's actually the most important break. And I think that's really important to think about. I mean, he's not arguing that the colonial state was ought to be celebrated or positive, but actually that the loss had happened already, and the colonial state actually just represents a different phase, a different kind of loss. So I think those are 2 important aspects of the piece. And about Ranjit Singh, so he basically says, this represents a form of Hindu monarchy in the Punjab. Any kind of adherence to the norms of the Khalsa that he paid was strictly lip service. And the way in which the so-called Anglo-Sikh wars proceeded were a result of the kind of, aristocratic kind of setup that he had come up with by the middle of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And I do think that, if I were to take a kind of look at this at his writing as a historian, I would say, there are several issues with this, and there is actually virtue to being more even-handed with how we understand the period.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say I completely sign off on his polemic, but it is important to read it as polemic, right? Which is to say that he was trying to make an argument that he felt was urgent to make.
Yeah.
And he was doing that, sometimes in broad strokes or in strong language that might kind of make us uncomfortable or something.
Yeah.
But it is kind of, I think, worth taking seriously. And he concludes his critique of Ranjit Singh with actually saying something important, which will be really important to how he understands his political work in his present, demanding a Sikh homeland, is he says that despite the kind of setbacks that Ranjit Singh's rule might have meant for the Sikhs, which is to say, this wasn't a kind of progression from the Misl period into the kind of Sikh polity that could have emerged.
Yes.
The Khalsa army, the army which actually fights in these wars and so forth, retains its status as kind of standard bearer for what could be a Sikh polity, right? So he says that we ought to look, he's suggesting, he doesn't really do this in the piece, but he's suggesting that there's actually a place we can turn to, which is the example of the Khalsa of Ranjit Singh's period, which actually continue to retain kind of what the best of what Sikh polity could be. So in that way, it's not purely just, negative critique. There's also kind of a positive element. And it is to the Khalsa where he's turning and making his most fervent statements in the present for kind of how we ought to fight for a Sikh homeland, right? So that's another part of it that's important.
And that brings us really nicely to our next question, that urgency that you're talking about. What's really interesting about Kapur Singh's life is that he's not just a thinker, he's not just a philosopher or a theologian. He's actually actively involved in politics. He creates an Akali Dal party. He runs for office. He serves in both the central government and in the state government of Punjab. And he very much was not only looking backward, but also trying to speak to the crises of his own present, and especially to young Sikhs. So what do you think made the youth such an important audience for him in the 60s and 70s?
I think he saw what was happening in the world. And I think that actually, as an aside, I should say, I think one of the reasons he retains his status as one of the most inspiring and interesting Sikh thinkers to read is that he was always, if you read some of his pieces, he's citing thinkers from all over the world, but also, he's reading widely, like he's reading not just kind of political thinkers around the world, right? He's kind of he thinks really expansively. And I think if you think of him as this kind of person who is really able to observe his own contemporary moment in a more zoomed out way than most of us are, you can imagine that he's kind of observing what's happening around the world. He has a speech at one point to the All India Sikh Students Federation where he actually says, look at the student protests that are happening in France in 1968. This is a speech from 1968. And he says, there's a way in which the students of France are recognizing their historical role in kind of making things different. And what, as the Khalsa, as the young Khalsa, do you see as your role in making things different for us as Sikhs? He talks a lot about it in his speeches to students about kind of a so-called prophecy of Guru Gobind Singh. And we don't need to get into the meaning of prophecy in a Sikh context, because he resolves the question for us at some point. He talks a lot about, the prophecy of Guru Gobind Singh, which I think basically says that is a prophecy that reportedly he makes that, for the foreigners will be driven out of India by the Khalsa. Do you know if that's correct?
Yes, it's something like that.
Something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that.
It's from,
And
I believe it might be from Sosaki.
yeah.
Yes.
And, it's up for debate, what the place of prophecy is for in Sikh thought. But at some point he says himself, I talk about this prophecy a lot, but it's not actually important whether the prophecy is true or whether what it means to give import to a prophecy. But what a prophecy suggests, the idea of the prophecy is important because it's suggesting kind of where change is headed in the present. A prophecy, in other words, becomes important because there is some kind of restlessness in the air, and that's why we end up giving import to something like a prophecy, right? The idea that things are bound to change is actually important because it just suggests that collective struggle is imminent and brewing. And I think he sees especially I can imagine as he's kind of, he doesn't die very old, but I think, in the late 60s and 70s, as he's kind of becoming more seasoned in his own career, I think he's seeing that, it's time for the new generation to imagine what the next phase of struggle looks like.
Yes.
And for him, it's the young Khalsa, which is, if you read his speeches, it's to the young Khalsa that he's often the most kind of inspiring, which I think just makes a lot of sense. And he's very cynical in his interviews, for example, like in newspapers and so forth. But I think adopts slightly different voice when he's speaking to young people.
Yeah. The last section of your essay is titled Thinking with Kapur Singh. And in that section, you emphasize that for Kapur Singh, while the goal may be fixed, its political form can change due to circumstances. So, what do you think it means to think with Kapur Singh today without simply repeating his mid 20th century formulations?
Yeah, autonomy is inevitable, inalienable and necessary, but primarily inevitable. And arguably, maybe inarguably, it hasn't been achieved 40 years after he passed away in 1986, now in 2026. And I don't, as a historian, it's not natural for me to say, well, what would he say now? Because in some ways it doesn't matter. But it is interesting as like a person.
Yes.
Historian versus person. The great duality of man. But as a person, I'm like, I found myself wondering the question that I imagine many of us readers of Kapur Singh might wonder is that, would he still retain the same kind of fidelity to an idea of postcolonial nationhood that he did in his period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I don't really obviously don't know what he would argue, but I can imagine that our analysis would have to change given the kind of political developments in India, right?
Yeah.
With the rise of the Hindu right so dramatically since the 90s into the present. We would also have to think, I think, about what it means to formulate a vision of autonomy for ourselves, given kind of increasing just number of people who are living in diaspora. I mean, both of us are kind of diasporic Sikhs, right?
Yes.
But also, the changing situation within India the so-called inspira within India, right? So I think there are just, things have changed in 40 years. We also had the entire period of the kind of counter-insurgent late 80s and 90s, right? The kind of militancy was completely defeated in some ways by the early 90s. And that was something that we don't know what he would have had to say about that and how he would evaluate that and the kinds of things, the kind of new kinds of indictments of Indian elites he might have coming out of that period. So I just think what I think I try to take away from my reading of Kapur Singh, which firstly I think we need to do a lot more work as researchers of the Sikh past. We need to do a lot more work just getting a sense of everything that he wrote and published and the various strands of his thinking. I think that as much as we read him widely, I don't know if we have a full understanding of his kind of full intellectual legacy. But I think we also need to maybe, where I think I find myself wanting to kind of ask questions in the way he asked questions, or think about things in the way he thought. What does it mean to insert one of his projects, I think, away from the kind of political project, was to really try to insert Sikh thought within a broad kind of global context, right?
Yes.
And I don't know if we've done that, for example. I don't know if we fully have taken stock of how to contextualize ourselves in a expansive way. And I think those are the kinds of things that he might be seeking to do. And I would be curious to keep thinking about, what it would mean to see how he imagined a Sikh homeland within the constraints of, kind of the heady days of decolonization and the early decades of kind of post-colonial nationhood, and then kind of extend them into the present when we've arguably reached another phase of the world order. I don't know if we live in a post-colonial world order anymore.
Yeah, we're living in interesting times, no doubt. But what it is, we're not sure right now.
We don't know, right? And I think with him, what I'm often struck with is that I think, like all great thinkers, there's this way in which he can observe his own moment that even to us feels prescient. Even after living the wake of 84, we read the Golden Temple piece from 74 and say he saw something that we don't even see.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of thing is I think what he leaves for me. So I don't know if I have anything concrete to say other than we ought to read him more and more closely.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion and a great place to end off. As someone who read Kapur Singh when I was younger, especially, and had a transformative impact on my understanding of Sikhi, I think it's so important to read his work, to understand the context in which he was writing, but also see that so many of his themes and ideas really are evergreen. They are always applicable to the Sikh experience. And we can learn a lot from the way that he thought and spoke and wrote about the world.
Yeah. And I think the other thing I'll just say is that there's a lot of things that I disagree with him on.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing is that we ought to read our great thinkers critically, for sure, and be willing to kind of I think part of the question of like what would Kapur Singh say in 2026 is what are the things he was maybe even wrong about,
Yes.
that he didn't see, that have come to pass, that maybe maybe that's one of the tasks.
Yeah.
He had, in not getting too into this, in part because I'm still trying to figure out for myself, but he had at various points kind of a willingness to ally with the then emergent, what we now will call the Hindu right, which hadn't emerged as such at that point. But there are things that, might make us uncomfortable. And I think it's worth being willing to have all of that in view.
Yeah, for sure. I think without going off on too much of a tangent, I think that's something that we as a community need to do a lot of, which is be able to appreciate the past and past thinkers, but be critical in a respectful way.
Yeah.
And I think too often we get into like this all or nothing sort of thinking. This is famously true of Ranjit Singh's era, where people will either think it's amazing and completely perfect, or people will reject it completely without looking at it critically and saying, this was good about that era and this was not so great about that era, and this is what we can learn and apply to our situation today, which is something that I think we need to do in a lot of different avenues and a lot of different spaces within the Panth right now. I think we'll wrap up there. I wanted to thank you so much for this article. It was such a pleasure to read and really fun to engage with. Did you have anything you wanted to say before we sign off?
I don't think so. Thank you. This has been fun to talk to you about.
Yeah, it's been really great. And I want to encourage everybody to please go to sikri.org/articles, and you can read Damanpreet's article in full. It's not a very long read, but it's a very in-depth overview of Kapur Singh's ideas about the Sikh nation, and gives us a lot to think about during this time of Vaisakhi, when we're really thinking about sovereignty and the Khalsa so much. What does Kapur Singh say? And I think on the 40th anniversary of his death, that's something that's worthwhile spending some time on and thinking about and having discussions about. So thank you again, Damanpreet Singh, for this article and for speaking with me today. And thank you so much for listening to us here at the Sikh Cast. We want to remind people that we are always putting out new episodes of the Sikh Cast, so please check back for new episodes, based on other articles or other work that we're doing here at the Sikh Research Institute. And we look forward to speaking with you again in the future. Thank you so much. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you for tuning into the Sikh Cast. View more Vaisakhi content at sikri.org/Vaisakhi.
You were listening to Sikh Cast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.